you have another 20 years before you get the story again. So it's a good investment of time, I think. It's a relatively famous story, biblical story. It's the story of the wisdom of Solomon, of the judgment of Solomon. In other words, Solomon prays to God and says, God, please give me wisdom. And God answers his prayer in his dream. And then the story following that immediately is the story of the judgment, where two women come to Solomon. Each one says, "Child is each one says, they both gave birth to children. One died. Each one claims the living child belongs to her. And now it's left to Solomon to decide. Unfortunately for him, there's no DNA evidence. There's no witnesses. It's her word against her word. What do you do?" So I think this is a relatively famous story. I think it's a famous story. I think the story is that Solomon listens to their discussion, and basically he says, "Okay, we're going to bring a sword. We're going to cut the child in half." And one mother says, one of the women says, "Fine, beautiful, cut the child in half." The other one says, "No, give it to the other woman, but keep the child alive." Solomon says, "Oh, that's the mother." That's a relatively famous story, and it's a nice story on the surface, but once you start drilling in, it's very difficult to understand. Is this the great brilliance of Solomon? It seems like a gimmick, and it seems like it was very risky. So we're going to discuss the risks in what Solomon did and what the great wisdom about what he did was. And to the extent that the Talmud says that some of the sages said, well, this is actually a foolish thing. It was almost like miraculous that it worked. There's also a medrash that states that when Solomon was very young at the time, he became a king when he was, I believe, 12 years old. So when Solomon says, "Bring the sword, and this is what we're going to do," the medrash says his ministers started quoting the verse. He says, "Woe to you is a land whose king is a youth." In other words, they saw this as a completely immature move on Solomon's part. We, of course, are going to dig a little deeper and see maybe there is a tremendous, and we know it was wisdom, but we want to see how does this story really express the greatness of Solomon's wisdom? So that's the journey for today. We'll start with the Haftorah. The Haftorah is in Kings chapter 3. It starts at verse 15. But if we have time, we'll also go to the beginning to get to the background. So I see Vicky is holding an art scroll. So in the art scroll, I'm going to share the screen in a moment. In the art scroll.
1143.
1143. Thank you, Vicky. Yeah, that's what we do.
1143,
yes,
right?
Indeed. Okay. So I'm going to share the screen, God willing, with the help of oops. Pause. Here. I think you see my screen. Is that right? You see the text, I think?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So if you notice, you're talking about Kings book 1, chapter 3. Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Okay, why do I have to know about this? Well, the point here is that in the beginning of the chapter, Solomon has this dream, and God comes to him and says, "What do you want?" And that's where he asks for wisdom. If we have time, we'll get to that part. But it's a very significant verse. Simply, it's a significant verse just to connect to the Haftorah, because this is really the link to the parsha. This is the link to the portion. Because what is the portion? The portion is that Pharaoh has dreams, and Pharaoh cannot figure out the interpretation of the dreams. And Joseph is the only one in the kingdom who's able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And because of that, because Joseph is able to interpret the dreams, that's why Pharaoh appoints him to be the leader of Egypt. So the connection, there has to be some connection between the story that we read in the 5 books of Moses and a section of the prophets that's selected. So most people believe, well, that's the easy link. The easiest link is Vayikat Shlomo v'nei chalom. Shlomo awoke, and behold, it was a dream, which is the exact same phrase used in this week's parsha. Vayikatz Paro. Paro awakened, and it was a dream. So that's the link to the parsha. If we have time, maybe we'll find a deeper link. Maybe we won't. We'll see. But in any case, so Solomon awoke. So I want to read the story quickly, and then we want to ask a few questions, and then we see it's not that long, and then we'll see if we can find some deeper insight and deeper wisdom. So I'm going to do this quickly. Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream, and he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered up burnt offerings and offered peace offerings, and made a feast for all of his servants. So Solomon serves God. After this dream, he comes to Jerusalem to serve God, and he makes a feast. Okay, now where do you see Solomon's wisdom? So the verse continues, then came two women, harlots, to the king and stood before him. Okay. And the woman said, "O my lord, I and this woman dwell in one house, and I gave birth to a child with her in the house. And it came to pass, the third day after I had given birth, that this woman gave birth also, and we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house, besides us two in the house. And this woman's son died at night, because she had lain on him." Verse 20. "And she arose in the middle of the night, and took my son from beside me, while your handmaid slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead son in my bosom." 21. "And I arose in the morning to nurse my son, and behold, he was dead. But I looked closely at him in the morning, and behold, it was not my son whom I had born. And the other woman said, Not so. The living is my son, and the dead is your son. And this one said, Not so. The dead is your son, and the living is my son. Thus they spoke before the king." So these are the two claims. Up to verse 22, we get the two claims. Now, verse 23, "And the king said, This one says, This is my son that lives, and your son is the dead. And the other says, Not so. Your son is the dead, and my son is living. And the king says, Fetch me a sword. And they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, Divide the living child in two, and give half to one and half to the other." Verse 26, And the woman whose son was the live one said to the king, for her compassion was aroused for her son, and she said, "O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means slay him." But the other said, "Let it be neither mine nor yours, divide it." 27, And the king answered and said, "Give her the living child, and by no means slay him, she is his mother." And verse 28, And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged. And they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment. In other words, this is a critical verse. We're talking about the beginning of the kingdom of Solomon. We're in chapter 3. Chapter 1 of the book is where the King David, his father, gives him his last will and testament. Chapter 2, we get into trouble where he has to get rid of the opposition in the kingdom. And chapter 3, he's very young and he's just establishing himself. And because of this story, the people accept and see that he indeed is the king, and he's granted with the divine wisdom. And in that leads to chapter 4, verse 1. And King Solomon was king over all Israel. In other words, the people accepted him because of this story. So that is the story. If anybody has any comments on the story, I would love to hear what people think about this story. And after that, we'll see if we can sort of collect from what the different perspectives are on this story. So do you think this was a good idea, Solomon's part? Was it a good move? Was it a bad move? Would you do any better or any worse?
Rabbi.
Yes.
Rabbi, a question, please. You said Solomon was 12 years old at the time. I mean, how many 12-year-olds nowadays, any time, do they have the mental capacity to make these type of judgments, or even to rule? A 12-year-old, I mean, they don't have the mental faculties, I would think.
Well, in a monarchy, if you're a son of the king, you could be a king even if you're 12. There were kings that were younger. If you look at the history of the monarchy. But yes, Solomon is considered, the Torah later says that he gets a tremendous wisdom, and he's the wisest of men. We consider him a very wise person. And what's interesting is that this story is the sort of the proof how wise he is. Now, if you want to say wise, maybe quote a sermon that he said, maybe quote a lecture. No, this is the story. This is the proof. In other words, the verse begins, Az Tavona, the first verse of the Haftorah. The first verse of the Az Tavona, then two women came. In other words, what's the when? After God promises him wisdom. In other words, this is the the playing out of this great wisdom. And the question, it's a nice gimmick. It's a nice gimmick. You have to admit. But is this the brilliance of Solomon? This proves to everybody how he's so wise. That is what we want to think about.
It never seems like it was so wise to me, because
Go ahead.
Because if the person really wanted the child, whether it was because of real love or to use as a slave or whatever, why would you want the child cut in half? It just didn't make sense that anybody would ever say, yeah, go ahead, do that.
Okay, excellent point. What Elisa is saying is, okay, it worked out. Solomon got lucky. This is not wisdom. What's the more likely case? The more likely case, that was more likely to happen is that both women would say, don't cut him in half. Both women would say, don't cut the child in half. Then what would Solomon do? And that's the more common case. In other words, the fact that this woman says, cut the child in half is something that, okay, it does speak volumes. Maybe it does tell you, it does inform you that she is not the mother, because a mother hopefully would not say, cut the child in half. But how could Solomon, when Solomon says, bring the sword and cut the child in half, how could he count on this playing out this way? How could he count on the woman who's not the real mother saying, cut him in half? It's much more likely that both women would say, don't cut him in half. And then what would he do? He brought this whole sword, he made this scene, he said something so ridiculous, all the servants would have said, this king is crazy. He wants to cut a child in half. He's 12 years old. We have to dethrone him. He's a dangerous man. Okay, so Solomon got lucky. He got lucky. The woman who wasn't his, the woman who wasn't the mother says, cut him in half, which now we have to figure out how, but again, how does he count on this? You know, they say in law, a good lawyer never asks a question until he knows the answer, unless he knows the answer, because you don't want any surprises. Solomon is setting himself up for a disaster. The fact that it worked out means Solomon got lucky. It doesn't mean Solomon is wise, seemingly.
I don't think so.
Go ahead, Vicky.
I think so. I think it's too wise. Of course, I agree with Richard. It's too wise for a 12-year-old. But however, a woman who is capable of taking somebody else's child and put the dead child instead is capable of more terrible things. So it is, of course, it's not typical of 12-year-old, but it requires a wisdom, and this story has a value not only because of the wisdom of the Solomon, but because it has a value of its own.
Yes. Okay, so Vicky says important. Vicky says that if a person is going to take another person's child, then they are so terrible and so narcissistic that they're actually willing to cut the child in half. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I will say that I think that some people would say, no, I think some people would say that there's a spectrum. And yes, some narcissists there is a spectrum. Some people who are willing to take someone else's child are willing to cut a child in half. But I think that's the extreme case. I think most cases, look about this woman. The woman just lost her child. She's probably in deep mourning. She's probably depressed. She's probably jealous. All those emotions are bubbling up within her. So she wants to take the child. So I understand it's a terrible thing. And Vicky says, if I'm taking someone else's child, I'm probably so selfish and I'm probably willing to cut the child in half. And you know something, Vicky, you're right, because that was the case with this woman. But the question is, could Solomon count on this? You know, I think it's just as likely, again, the question, I'm still questioning and we have the answer. Don't worry. Didn't bring you here together to ask questions. It's more likely that it's more likely that both women would say. That's why the Medrash says that, that's why the Medrash says that the ministers thought this was crazy, and even some of the rabbinic rabbis say this was a bad idea, because the more likely outcome would be theoretically that both women would say, don't cut him. And then what does Solomon do? Then he proposes a solution that didn't work. So that's the question. So now let me give you what some of the commentators are saying. And here's what I'm putting out. Something in the story tells Solomon he knows who the mother is. Not only he knows who the mother is, he also knows how the women are going to react. He knows that the woman who's not the mother is going to agree to cut the child in half. He knows that. He senses that with his wisdom. How? Because he listens carefully to what they say. And if you listen carefully to what people say, you can understand what they're going to do. And therefore, Solomon himself knows what to do. He already knows the answer. The problem, the reason why he makes this whole story with the sword is not for himself. It's not a test for Solomon. Solomon knows who the mother is, and he knows which mother is the real mother, according to the commentators, some commentators. So why does he bring the sword? The sword is not for Solomon. The sword is the theatrics. It's for the people. And that's how the people around could see what Solomon saw. Now, how do I know? How does Solomon know who the real mother is? That we're going to get dressed to in a second. But I see Zach is gearing up for a question, so I'm getting excited. Go ahead.
Thanks. Different interpretation. I don't think he knew who the mother was. I think why this story is important for all of us. It's an indication that in difficult situations you can go in so-called what I call meta space. Sometimes evidence is not enough. You don't just look at the evidence. You create some evidence. I can give you several other examples, but it wasn't that in this case, he tried to create new evidence. He, instead of going to DNA, like you said, or something. And he wouldn't have stopped if both of them said, don't cut. It's just indication of the process he would have started. He would have suggested maybe ask them some other questions or something. There are, it's interesting that it's interesting approach is outside of judicial system that you don't just look at the evidence, but you look as people react after crime is committed. It's maybe, and that's what he is doing. That's first indication that I know in history that people are doing this. Very quickly, I give you one example about birth certificate of Obama. Trump could have gone to Hawaii and checked, find people, doctors. Instead, he said, "I'll give you $50 million if you show me birth certificate." And Obama refused. So the same way, Trump also went into meta space, and in eyes of many, that clearly proved that something was fishy with his birth certificate. Because he said, you can use $50 million for any of your charity. No, I don't want to show you in principle. That's a similar example.
Yeah. So without getting the political, because we don't want anyone to get upset. But you're right. So Solomon has no evidence, so he's creating the evidence. He's creating a trap, creating a test, and I agree with you. But again, and I agree with you that's a valid interpretation. I just want to present an alternative interpretation that's not alternative. It supplements yours, and then you tell me if you think this is convincing. Again, it doesn't say so in the verse, but it doesn't say so explicitly. I'm going to put out, in other words, you're right. He's looking for additional interpretation. What did he see? So that's what we're going to see. And the message is going to be, from this interpretation, the message is going to be is Solomon's wise, not because he can write a PhD dissertation, not because he can write a doctorate. No, he's wise because he understands people, and he's a good listener. Usually we say the guy's a good speaker, he's so smart. But if you're a good therapist, if you really want to understand the psychology of people, if you listen carefully, you will learn a lot more than by giving your speeches. And that is, at least according to some commentators, is what's happening here. And I'm going to jump right in. I'm not going to keep it to the end. I have my main point that I want to keep. Is my main point. I'm going to give it away. I'm giving it away the next 60 seconds. And then if you want to go off, you can go off. You got everything I have to say. Okay, I have additional things, but this is the main point. Here we go. I want to share the screen in the meantime, so we could look at the verses. First thing that happens, the rabbis point out, it's very interesting, is they look at the story and they say, what legal principles could we derive from this story? Of course, don't try this in court. In other words, this idea of using the judge's intuition, we don't like it so much. We'd rather have evidence. But the rabbis do deduce from this story a very interesting principle. And that's verse 23. After the litigants said their claims, the king summarizes them. And the king said, this one says, etc. And the other one says, etc. And now, waiting till the people agree. In other words, once they agree, he continues. So there's a very interesting point that Talmud says that the king has it's almost like a closing argument. Remember, there's no lawyers then, so the king has to do this for the litigants. But after all the whole story, you have to give a summary of your argument, and the Talmud says this is something that Solomon does. By the way, this is just an aside. One of the interesting things I didn't mention is Solomon is so wise. He's the quintessential judge. Okay, what's the story that shows this? Two women come before him. Okay, who are these women? What do they do for a living? Are they the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies? Of course not. They are they are two women harlots. Okay, so they're in some sense on the lowest level of society. What do you see here? You see here the poorest people, the most disadvantaged people can get a hearing at the Supreme Court. In other words, they can go straight to the highest authority of the land. If you're poor in this country or in other modern countries, good luck getting a lawyer. Good luck getting before the most important judge of the land. So this is another thing that we see throughout the Torah. The Torah emphasizes that whenever the Torah teaches the laws of judgment, the Torah says you have to go. The test of a society that has justice is that if this justice system is here to protect not just the rich and powerful, but also the people who are disfortunate. And you see this in many cases. Like, for example, there's a whole section in the Torah called Mishpatim, called laws. Okay, so what's the first amendment? What's the first law that we learn? Whose rights do we need to protect? Answer: the servant, someone who sells himself as a servant for 6 years. That's the first thing we talk about. How are you going to protect his rights? How are you going to make sure he's released at the end of 6 years, et cetera, et cetera? And whenever the Torah talks about judgment, it's almost always in the context of, again, you have many other laws, but the emphasis, both the beginning and the end, is talking about cases that are relevant to the weakest people of society. So some people believe, I also think so, some people believe that the concept, the fact that the case that's here to prove Solomon's wisdom and Solomon's commitment to justice plays out not when the two generals come before the king for a judgment, right? That's common in the ancient world and even in the modern world. But that the king is going to deal with two women who are harlots and sit and try to figure out who's right and who's wrong, instead of just dismissing them as people that society doesn't have to protect, that is a testament to Solomon's commitment to judgment. I don't think it's Solomon. I think it's the culture. I think it's the Jewish culture, but that's just an aside. Okay. So the most compelling point is, you would see it in verse 22, and it's repeated in 23 by King Solomon. So King Solomon picked up this subtlety. 22 is what the women say, and 23 is King Solomon summarizing what the women say. And if a Torah is saying he summarizes it, it's very likely that he got the point. What happens? Verse 22. And the other woman said, not so. The living is my son, and the dead is your son. And this one said, not so. The dead is your son, and the living is my son. Thus they spoke before the king. Now the king has to summarize. And the king said, this one says, this is my son that lives, and your son is dead. And the other said, not so. Your son is the dead, and my son is the living. Okay, what happened here? If Solomon's listening carefully, and he says, here is the point, ladies and gentlemen. The mother, the real mother, talks about first the living son. The other woman begins by saying, your son is dead. And then she says, my son is alive. In other words, what's her main point? Your son is dead. The woman is the real mother. How does she start? She starts, my son is alive and your son is dead. How are they speaking? What are they focusing on? Are you focusing on the live son or the dead son? King Solomon picks this up. And look what King Solomon says. And the king said, this one says, this is my son that lives, and your son is the dead. And the other says, not so. Your son is the dead, and my son is the living. Both in the words of the woman and in the summation of Solomon, who's just echoing what the woman said. One woman focuses, like I said, on the fact that your child is dead. Oh, by the way, my child is alive. The other woman says, my child is alive, your child is dead. So some commentators are saying that Solomon therefore realizes that for one of them is connected to this child, and that's the focus. The other one is not connected to the child. The other one is thinking about what's pressing in her mind is her own dead child. So the first thing she talks about is the death. She's not talking about the life. And from this woman whose child died, she's so broken and so pained that what she wants, she's experiencing the death much more than she's experiencing the life. So when the king comes and says, okay, cut the kid in half, let everybody die, she's like, okay, if my son died, let everybody die. But the king is expecting this to happen. He doesn't know for sure, of course, but he's expecting this to happen. Otherwise, if he expected that both women are going to say it's mine, these commentators say, I'm not sure Solomon would propose this. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But the point is, this theory says King Solomon is listening carefully. And if he's listening carefully, what's happening here is that he's saying one woman is focused on life, one woman is focused on death. I think that's a beautiful interpretation. I don't know that it's right or wrong. I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know what Solomon was thinking, but I think as a theory, it's a beautiful theory. That's what I think. We have other points that support the idea that Solomon already suspects he knows the answer beforehand. But this is, I think, the most clear. There's one more point that I'll say in a moment, but I think this is the most clear. If this is the case, if this commentary is correct, what they are saying is now the test of the sword is not really for Solomon, right? The test of the sword is for everybody else. And that's what it says at the end, verse 28. Then all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged, right? You have a gimmick, you have a show, and that's what the masses could understand. Right? Nobody is used to the idea of Freud that people are going to speak, and what they speak is really expresses what's really happening within your soul. The whole concept of a Freudian slip, that wouldn't sell almost 3,000 years ago. So the people would say, what? The king, he said this, she said this or that or that. That's not justice. So the king now makes a show for the masses. That's this theory. Again, I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm putting out the theory out there. Not my theory, putting out the theory out there. So that's that point. If anyone has any comments on that, please share. Otherwise, we go to another subtlety.
Fascinating, really interesting. Thank you.
Yes, this is good stuff. Now, another modern way of reading the story, which the Torah does not agree with. In other words, the verse goes out of its way to say, okay, I'm putting out another theory. I can get into trouble. I can get this. I can get. What's the word I'm looking for? I can get disbarred for saying this, but I'll say this anyway. Okay. In other words, this is not the traditional view whatsoever. The untraditional view, and I read this from judges in Israel who know the story, and they say, what is a judge in Israel? A secular judge, not religious whatsoever. What would the secular judge do with this story? And I'm just putting it out there because it's interesting. The secular judge says as follows. Solomon doesn't care who the mother is. It doesn't matter who the mother is. Who's the biological mother? Mother doesn't matter. What matters is who's going to treat the child properly. That's what matters. And that's the test of Solomon.
That's good.
Does the Solomon know who's the mother? Doesn't matter who's the mother. It's the wrong question to ask who's the biological mother. The right question to ask is who's going to take care of the child. Now, I cannot accept this as a rabbi, because the Talmud says that when verse 27, when 27 says, and the king answered and said, give her to the living child, and by no means slay him, she is his mother. The Talmud says she is his mother is the narrator. That's sort of that's the voice of prophecy. In other words, the story is telling you she is the biological mother. In other words, it's not that this story proves that the biological mother is separate from the caring mother. To the contrary, the purpose of the story is that a natural mother, if everything is healthy, the natural mother is going to have compassion on her child. So that's why, again, I'm not saying I buy this interpretation, but I think it's interesting to put out there of what people do with this story. And that concept that Solomon really doesn't care who the mother is, he cares who's going to treat the child like a mother. And that's just as important, maybe more important. So I think this was too interesting for me not to say, even though I like I said, I can't say this is the traditional interpretation, but this was too good not to say.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was beautiful. Both of those interpretations are beautiful.
I feel like the second one is
Even more.
is the opposite of my point from before. That this is why I don't like it, because again, what's the purpose in the woman wanting the child? For whatever reason, you want the child alive. You don't want the child dead. So I agree that if the mother said, yeah, I want to keep him to work for me, versus the other one, I want to keep him to be my child and love him, you could say that. But I still don't buy that the woman who wants the child will say, fine, cut him in half.
There is a in modern Hebrew, some of the verses of Tanakh trickle into modern Hebrew. Okay. And it plays out in society. For example, and by the way, you stop some Israelis who don't even know the origin of the phrase, but the phrase makes into popular culture. For example, there is a phrase that was Samson. Samson was the whole story. Samson was a great warrior, and eventually he's taken captive because his hair is cut. It's a whole story, fascinating story. We'll read about him in the Haftorah of Naso. We have a few months for that. So Samson is taken prisoner. He's tortured. They poke out his eyes. He's blinded. And then he's put in a building, and where there's a big festival of all the Philistines. Samson prays to God. He says, give me strength. I'm going to break the pillars of the building of the foundation, and the entire structure will collapse, and all the Philistines will die. The problem is, it's a suicide mission. He will also die. Okay? So in the Hebrew, it's called Tamot Nafshi Im Plishtim. He said, let my soul die with the Philistines. In other words, at some point, I'm willing to sabotage myself if I'm sabotaging my enemy. That's an example. Another example is this verse, verse 26.
Can you say the Hebrew again from the first one? Tamot
nafshi im plishtim. Let my soul die together with the Philistines. Right? So in other words, it became so literally means I'm going to die. I'm a kamikaze. I'm going to die and kill the Philistines. But in modern Hebrew, it means if I'm going to sabotage my own interest, as long as it sabotages the interest of my enemy, I use that same phrase. It's also very often used in the political arena. I could bring you examples. I'm not going to do it this second. I want to introduce one more verse. In the verse 26, it also trickled into modern Hebrew. Let it be neither mine nor yours. Divide it. Gam li, gam lach lo yihiyeh is the Hebrew. I'm trying to highlight it. Yes. Gam li, gam lach lo yihiyeh. Let it neither be mine nor yours. I think, Elisa, you're speaking rationally. But the human emotion is such that when somebody is either in pain or in jealous or not, there's so much. We're complicated. We're a complicated species. When someone is suffering, they don't want other people. They don't want other people to experience joy. No one's thinking logically. They'd rather, yes, let both of us be sad. And again, I'm not a psychologist, but I've seen this in my own life. And therefore, it's not a surprise. It's not as shocking that somebody would say this, in my view. Is it rational? No, but we're not rational actors, especially when you come to issues of childbirth. And this is talking about this, certainly depression, postpartum depression, and mourning, all mixed into one. I mean, there's no, I don't think it's fair to look for reason, in my view. So I'm just saying that's my response. Again, that I'm just putting it out there. I'm not telling you what happened and what didn't happen because I wasn't there. I want to say one more thing.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that because there is so much wisdom aside from the proof of King Solomon's wisdom. in that story, like universal wisdom. And what you're touching upon, I don't want to bring up any labels, but the woman who is, to my first point, the woman who is capable of taking somebody else's son and claim it, she's not that emotional. She's not capable of, I don't want to again bring any labels, but she's not capable of any compassion. And that's why most likely, and that's why the order is reversed. And that's why he picked up on this. So all those interpretations, they all tie together and they're all beautiful. And it's very, very good story for all of us to learn from.
I think so. It's certainly to think about. Now, I want to just say, Vicki, I think you're right in the sense that some people are as you describe it. But I want to say, for everyone speaks from their experience. I'll tell you an experience that I experienced. There was a woman I knew, and she suffered from infertility. Okay, this woman had a sister who also suffered from infertility. Okay, it so happened that woman number one had a child, and it so happened that woman number two, I can't say what woman number two did, but woman number two literally screamed at woman number one, like blaming her for having a child first. Okay. Now the story ends. Both of them have children, and everybody lives happily ever after, and they're still close. But I'm saying, could you blame? I don't think that other woman number two screaming at woman number one is an evil person. Right? I think that these emotions run very deep, and you can't blame people for feeling the way they feel. And Vicki is right that for some people, this means that the person is, your child dies and you're willing to take someone else's child and you're willing to lie about it. It means you're incapable of compassion. And I agree that there's some people are like that, but I don't know that we have to go to those extreme cases. I think that people are complicated enough as it is, that this is not as uncommon as we would have expected. And people are, this other woman does not have to be such a terrible person. This woman is a normative person suffering terribly from pain and mourning and depression. That's just my reading. Again, I'm not saying your reading is wrong, because like I said, there is a spectrum, and some people who are capable of doing this are indeed narcissistic. Okay, enough said about this thing. One more point, and this is straight for Zach, because I think you'll love this. It turns out the woman who's lying has a beautiful, fleshed out, detailed story. She knows exactly what happened when she was asleep. The woman who's saying the truth does not produce a story to counter that story. She just says one word: this is my child. So make up a story, say, I came, I went, I had coffee. No, this is my child. That's all she says. Let's read it inside. You will see that I'm right. Okay? Here, how many verses the first woman who speaks, who turns out to be the wrong woman, not the mother, look how long she speaks. Verse 17. This is woman number one, who's not the mother. And the one woman said, "Oh my Lord, I and this woman dwell in one house, and I give birth to a child with her in the house." Okay, that's fine. And it came to pass on the third day that I had given birth, that this woman gave birth also. And we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house besides for us two in the house. That's fine. I'm not counting verse 17 and 18 as the story. Now comes the story. And this woman's son died at night because she had laid on him. Okay? Remember, this woman is going to say, the woman accusing says, I was asleep. But she says, she knows what happened to the other woman. I'm asleep, but I know that the other woman's child died. Why did the child die? There could be many causes of death. No, I'm sleeping, but I know the cause of death. I know it's the other one slept on the child and choked him. Maybe a cat came, maybe a mouse came, maybe a snake came. I don't know. No, but she knows. Remember, she's asleep, and she knows that the other person suffocated the child. Then she continues, and she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your handmaid slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead son in my bosom. She's describing. And I rose in the morning to nurse my son, and behold, he was dead. But I looked closely at him in the morning, and behold, it was not my son whom I had born. What does the second woman say? So we have how many verses? We have 19, 20, 21. What does the second woman say? And the other woman said, not so. The living is my son, and the dead is your son. Now, I would expect this woman to counterclaim and say, no, You woke up in the middle of the night and you came to me and you switched my child. She doesn't say so. Why doesn't she say so? Because she doesn't know she was asleep. I don't know anything about your story. All I know that this is my child. What you did, you got up, you switched. I can't speak to that. I was asleep. I don't know. So what's fascinating here is that sometimes the guy with the more thought out story and knows all the details, and knows exactly what happened, is not necessarily the one saying the truth. In fact, it's a little contradictory because the person says, I was asleep. So that's just something for Zach to contemplate and comment. But I thought that was entertaining. Not my main point, but interesting nonetheless.
Rabbi, I have a question for you.
Go ahead. Let me just hear from Zach for a second. Looks like he wants to, and then you're next, Neil.
Okay, sure.
I think I'm impressed with what you said. First of all, very impressed. I wrote 2 books on what I call M theory in going into meta space, and I'm writing another one. And Solomon example is one of the key examples in my books.
Oh,
and what you just said, it's a perfect illustration of what meta theory is. You look at something around it. This is a very good argument. One final, very good argument, almost the same like Solomon did. The rest that, she said, no, your child is alive, you're dead. It's linguistic, it's not convincing, but this is very good argument. One final comment. We are talking as if we know who the mother is. We don't know.
We
know what Solomon said, but and it seems reasonable, but you never know in any judgment. That's a very, very good point here also. And one of them could have been smarter, could have been faster, could have been quicker, or just could have called bluff of Solomon. And once he raised the sword, he would have said, oh, no, stop. We still don't know who the mother is, but his decision is very wise, and what you said is very wise also.
Yeah, so thank you. But like I said, the traditional view, and again, nobody can prove it, we weren't there, we have no DNA, but the traditional view is that the narrator, the prophet, the person writing the book says, we have the prophecy, this is the child. But again, it may or may not be the point. Like I said, the judges who read the story say it's not the point. We don't care who the mother is. We care who cares for the child. Now, you said you're not so convincing. So if you would be a psychologist, you would, in other words, it would be more compelling. In other words, every person, what I love about the story is every person approaches it with their training and sees something else. And who's right? They're all right. I don't know who's right. In other words, all I'm trying to say is someone who understands psychology, in other words, who thinks about Freud, thinks about Freudian slips, thinks this is significant. I'm not a psychologist. For me, that's not as significant. Everybody has their angle looking at the story. And to me, that's the wisdom. The wisdom is that everybody looks at it and sees something else in it. And that's part of the beauty. So I appreciate everybody's contributions. This is way more interactive than usual and therefore much more fun for me. So thank you everybody for participating. Neil, please help us out here.
I don't know if I'm going to help you, but I'm going to raise another question.
That helps. That helps. Absolutely.
Okay. I'm reading this story now through fresh eyes, and I'm really wondering why the women don't have names.
Why the women have no names? That's a good question. Well, I don't know the answer to the question. Part of it is a name means a personality. A name means a personhood. In some sense, justice is when both people are anonymous, right? If I say there was this person and that person came to judgment, okay, then I start thinking, who's saying the truth? Well, let's look at their records. Let's look at the police records. Let's see what, in some sense, in judgment, the fact that they're anonymous may or may not. I don't know. I'm just saying from my training as a Talmudic student, when I see that the Talmud says that when two parties come before you, you have to look at them equally and ignore the differences, ignore their social status, ignore the past. You have to treat them both as you have to be, in other words, you have to be suspect to both of them equally. So from my perspective, when I hear that the women are anonymous, this sounds consistent with what I would think that the Torah would say about judgment.
Maybe they just archetypes. Like
the archetypes, or it could be that nobody knew their names because they were harlots, and again, they were not that significant in the community. But again, I think that the fact that if the Torah doesn't say their name, means it's not important. Why is it not important? Either because Vicky's saying is one extreme, they're not individual. In other words, they don't represent the individual person. They represent a type of person. Or from the perspective is who they were. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter. That's part of the point. Part of the point is in judgment, it doesn't matter who the person is.
I'm just following up on that. Just looking at this story again as a TV show. There's no other people in the room with them. I mean, if there's two women sleeping in a room, there might be other people sleeping in the room.
So part of this is that they're harlots. If they were married, they had a husband there. If they were married, they may each have their own house, right?
So that they don't have other women there. They don't have other children. They don't have husbands.
That represents the fact that they're not. When you live in other words, in the ancient world, people lived together with family, with community. The fact that they were alone just emphasizes how they were not a normative people in society. And that's part of the story. If you take the position that I'm taking, that part of the story is that when the Torah wants to emphasize, Solomon is a good judge. He's wise. He listens to people. He respects people, and anybody can come before him. They do studies now that who gets heard before the Supreme Court. Okay, so they do studies. Poor people have less and less of a chance. They do the percentages of people. I once read about this. I once read about this. That I think I wrote about it as well. That I quoted the research that they talk about. Basically, more and more, increasingly, it's just the rich and powerful that can get before the Supreme Court, or if you're on death row. But I'm just saying that for an average person to get to the point where you can be heard and be well represented, certainly if you're poor, in this country is a serious problem. It's a serious problem. So we're talking about modern societies dedicated to justice, and we have a long way to go in the poor being represented properly. And go ahead.
So just picking up on what you just said, maybe part of the wisdom of Solomon is that he chooses this as his first case.
That's a good point. It's not a mistake. This is the first case. He could have said, let the other case come, maybe.
He doesn't choose. He didn't chose it. It was sent to him.
We don't know, because Neil's argument is there were three cases waiting in the waiting room, right? And he took this to be we don't know. But that's nothing happens by mistake. You know, when the Supreme Court takes a case, it's one in whatever the case is. They take 8,000 out of I don't know, a few 100,000 cases per year. So yeah, that's that. Yeah, again, like I said, most of this I don't know. The question is not what happened. The question is what questions and what lessons does this story raise. If it's getting us thinking, then we are doing well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a wonderful day. Stay warm and stay safe. And if you want to warm up, join us tomorrow at 10 o'clock for the Torah class, and that will warm up your soul. And if you still need extra help, you can also make coffee or tea or hot cocoa, and then you'll be even warmer, both body and soul, and that will be a very wholesome experience.
God willing, we'll have power to get on the class.
That's very good.
Great.
And I have my cell phone, so I don't need no landline. Okay.
Yasha Kov, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Be well. Thank you.